This film does have, it has guns, it has violence, it has blood, it has death, but it has a lot of things that Park Chan-wook's other films do not have, which is warmth, humour and tenderness. And the film's drama takes place almost exclusively in this demilitarised zone, which is the heavily fortified border between North Korea and South Korea. As you'll find out, just as the film starts, it centres on a border crossing, and in fact later is revealed to be a series of border crossings along this, along the joint security area or demilitarised zone. These border crossings are both geographical and metaphorical. There's an elliptical prologue which reveals that there's been gunfire, and from that we can extrapolate, aided by the fabulous moody music. This music has been reused in a lot of documentaries on the Nat Geo channel and stuff like that. It's great music. And we can extrapolate from the music there's been a death, but we don't know who's been killed for another 6 minutes after the bullets go off, and we spend the majority of the film trying to figure out why. Okay, so it's a film that requires excavation of details, and likewise appraisal of this film requires excavation of history, and that's film history and actual history or general history. So I'm going to start with the film history first, and what may seem like an obscure connection, I'm going to start with James Cameron's Titanic in 1997, which had been a worldwide giant, enabled James Cameron to get up at the awards, say King of the World and all that kind of stuff. And, that film broke box office records all around the world. And it was a reinforcement of the fact that, a familiar fact, that the popularity of Hollywood cinema often has a detrimental effect upon local cinema. But in 1999, 2 years after the release of Titanic, South Korea bucked the trend. In that year, they produced a film that surpassed Titanic at the Korean box office. The success of this film that surpassed Titanic was a film called Shiri, and I'll get to that in a sec. And this was not the only way that South Korea was bucking the trend. From 1996 to 2005, box office returns in South Korea tripled from 42 million tickets annually to 148 million tickets. In that same time frame, the market share of Hollywood product went down. So Americans had 77% of the Korean box office, and it dropped to 38%. Or to put it round the other way, Korean films went from having 23% of the box office up to around 60%. So, and it's stayed at that level ever since. It hovers between 50 and 60%. And as a point of comparison, last year in Australia, when Mad Max Fury Road was, big international, big hit, Australian film only got 8% of the box office last year. So now there's a lot of reasons for why this happened, and I could easily spend the rest of the hour talking about that. But there's one key thing that needs to be focused on, and that's the fact that Korean corporations started to invest in movies with government encouragement. And this was brought about by a report from in 1993 by the Presidential Advisory Committee on Science and Technology. And one of the findings of that report was that they realised that Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park earned the equivalent of 1.5 million Hyundai cars. Okay, so in 1993, there are only 640,000 cars exported from Korea. So that means that with a right hit film, you could make 3 years worth of car production profit. So they said, okay, we're going to go into the movies, big time. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with that logic because, film is one of the riskiest businesses there is. But despite the fact that there's things wrong with that logic, in 6 years' time, Samsung Entertainment made this film called Shiri, and it was a spy thriller, and that was the film that broke Titanic's record at the Korean box office. It went on to bigger success. It was also the #1 film in Japan at one stage and the #1 film in Hong Kong. So now, it takes more than one film, one blockbuster, to change the kind of fate of a film culture. And so while Shiri was making breaking records everywhere, there were several other films in the pipeline. And the next film that broke a box office record in Korea, and box office records kept on breaking for the next decade. The market kept expanding. So JSA broke Shiri's record 1 year later, and almost every year, in fact a couple of times, twice in 1 year, the box office was broken again. Now, there was another aspect of JSA another aspect of government planning that made JSA a hit. Now, this is where we get into the actual history stuff. So I'm going to hope that you all know that the Korean Peninsula has been divided into two countries since the end of the Korean War in 1953. And on the top half, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, most widely known as North Korea, is a communist or left-wing dictatorship, if you will. And until the early 1990s, the Republic of Korea, what most widely known as South Korea, was a right-wing dictatorship. So democracy has only been present in South Korea for 25 years, which is like a blip as far as history is concerned. And when the switch to democracy in South Korea happened, it formalised in 1992, and that coincided with the collapse of communism, and it also meant the collapse of the Soviet Union, who was the #1 bankroller of North Korea's economy. So South Korea was booming with capitalism, North Korea was like just dropping down and down with their communist ideology. So at this point, the South Korean government felt that they could be generous, and they came up with what they called the Sunshine Policy. And so the idea was to be friendly towards North Korea and establish ongoing friendly relations between the two Koreas, who today are still technically at war. Okay. And in the heart of most Koreans is this dream that the two countries will be united. Okay. Both countries have different ideas about how that should be achieved. But for 1,000 years, it was one united kingdom. And over the past 130 years, they've had civil war, occupation by Japan, ongoing conflict. There's skirmishes all the time, as you see in the newspapers. And if you took the North Korean view, partial occupation of the peninsula by the United States. Okay. So that's a bit of Korean politics 101, which I hope will kind of guide you through this. And JSA was an advance on Shiri in a different way, in that Shiri was like a film with a Cold War mentality, very black and white thinking and what have you. And a mere 18 months later, JSA was enabling government and audiences in Korea to look at the North in a different way. In the height of the Sunshine Policy, there was a summit between the two Korean leaders, President Roh Moo-hyun and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, and one of the gifts of exchange was a pack of DVDs which included this film. Okay, so South Korean films, since they started being made in the 1950s, have been using North Koreans as bad guys and bad girls since that time, and right up to and including Shiri. And most of those films have kind of been obsessed with the idea of what's going to happen when the North Koreans come down. This is, I think, the first, and certainly one of the few, that thinks about what's going to happen if the South Koreans go up.